All right. In this video, I'm going to give you a quick recap of how racist ideas were spreading in the colonies and how anti-racists were responding, and then how even more segregationists and segregationists and assimilationist ideas were brought in. So there are some chapters that we're going to skip ahead, and in those chapters, it talks about a couple of big acts of anti-racism. First one is a group of Mennonites who are a group that's similar to Quakers in some ways, like wanting more of a simple life, some lifestyle rules, and they actually wrote letters against slavery, saying that racial oppression is just as bad as the religious oppression that they experienced that brought them to America. So this is one of the first documented cases of people speaking out against slavery who weren't themselves slaves. And the other example that maybe you talked about in social studies is called Bacon's Rebellion. There was a white man, Nathaniel Bacon, who tried to lead a rebellion. There's a picture of it here, bringing together poor white people who were servants, also with black slaves, saying that they're all in the same class economically, and so they should unite against rich whites. And that obviously was seen as a problem to have that kind of unity. And so segregationists responded in a couple of ways. They created sort of the idea of white privilege, and Jason Reynolds talks about this on page 27. Only the white rebels who were involved in Bacon's Rebellion were pardoned, were given an excuse. And segregationist laws also sort of started to respond to making sure that white people and black people who were both poorer in the colonies never worked together again. And so they did two things. They made sure that any white servants who ran away with an escaped slave, if they were caught, they would have to go back and do the job for the master of that escaped slave. So they went from indentured servant to actually a worse position. So they were had a really high punishment for like uniting or working with any Africans that were trying to get free, African Americans. And the second thing was that poor whites, if they didn't own any slaves themselves, they were forced to join slave patrols. There's a picture of this over here on the left, and those were groups of men that would kind of roam around and trying to catch escaped slaves. Because continuing to escape and run away was one form of fighting back that slaves used to, that enslaved people used to raise their voice against these conditions they were in. So, as like we read about in the chapters, they're growing tobacco, they're making sugar, there are a lot of industries that are really, really getting huge and needing a lot of labor. And so there's more and more enslaved people being forced to come to the colonies and work. And there were, as the population got bigger, people got more and more afraid of something like Bacon's Rebellion happening again. And so they instituted even more colonial codes in the 1700s. And these are listed on page 34 and 35 of our book. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of background of some of those. First one is that Native people and Black people were classified as livestock, or the property of the person that owned them as slaves. Also, Black people were not allowed to hold office. No interracial relationships were allowed, and this was all over the colonies: Virginia, Massachusetts, Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, Carolinas, and Georgia. And there was also a law passed that sort of continued to reward white people and sort of punish Black people who were from the lower class. And the way that looked is that when white servants were given their freedom, they would get 50 acres of land, some crops, some other stuff, while Black people who were enslaved, all of any property they had was sold. They never got to hold on to it. And so I included over here a graph of this is from 2010, so a little bit old, but just how that legacy really, really continues. So when you continue to take away the property generation to generation, even back in the 1700s, that has a long-term effect. So we see some lasting effects like the wealth gap today because of that. So the question that we're trying to figure out is how could this actually have been allowed to happen? And in order for laws like this to be put into place, the people making them had to somehow believe they were doing the right thing. And that's where assimilationist thinking really comes in. And remember, here's a picture of our friend Zurara. He was the one who planted that, what Reynolds calls that poisonous idea, that seed, that somehow slavery and all of these forms of oppression were for the betterment of society. And so that's what we're going to really track in our work today, is that kind of more sneaky form. It is definitely a form of racism, called assimilationist thinking. So we'll be reading chapter 5 and looking for examples of assimilationist thinking. So thanks for your catch up. And be sure to fill out one example of colonial law that upheld segregation before you move on to task 2.